Good afternoon. Welcome to Kingston WritersFest. My name's Barbara Bell, and I'm so pleased to present Author, an event in celebration of the Governor General's Literary Awards. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the festival staff and board prepare this festival and from which we're generating this online presentation is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their historical and ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. This event is organized in collaboration with the Canada Council for the Arts to celebrate the Governor General's Literary Awards. We're so grateful to those organizations and individuals who support the festival. Today, Kingston WritersFest would particularly like to thank Patricia MacKay and Gillian Graham, author patrons of Joan Thomas and Jane Urquhart. The Canada Council, GG Books, Heritage Canada, Ontario Arts Council, the City of Kingston, and Kingston Arts Council. Also, special thanks to Tourism Kingston for their marketing support. And thank you to you also, those of you who have joined us, those of you who have donated to the festival. We're so A little bit of housekeeping very quickly. The event is 45 minutes long. It includes a brief question and answer period. If you use the Zoom Q&A function, which you'll find by hovering at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll be able to tell us maybe where you're joining us from, but also you can post your questions for Joan there as well. Complete our online survey for a chance to win a pass to next year's festival or a basket of books. Check our website for details. I'll now introduce Jane Urquhart, our interviewer for this event, and then I will turn the proceedings over to her. Jane Urquhart, one of Canada's best-loved writers, was born in Little Long Lac, Ontario, which is in the far north of the province, and she grew up in Northumberland County. She now makes her home there with her husband, artist Tony Urqhart. For the past 3 decades, however, she has spent a portion of every year in Ireland. The author of 7 internationally acclaimed novels that together have won and been nominated for a plethora of international awards. A non-exhaustive list includes Le Prix du Meilleur Livre Étranger from France, the Impact Dublin Prize, the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, the Orange Prize, and the Booker Prize, and domestically, the Trillium Award, the Governor General's Award, and the Giller Prize. She won the Governor General's Literary Award for her novel, The Underpainter. In 2016, she published A Number of Things, Stories of Canada, Told Through 50 Objects, a beautiful book. It was commissioned by publisher HarperCollins to celebrate Canada's sesquicentennial. Jane's work has been translated into numerous foreign languages. Along with many literary distinctions and honors, Jane was named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2005. You barely have enough fingers on both hands to number her honorary doctorates, and she has traveled worldwide giving readings and lectures. We've been very fortunate to welcome Jane to our festival stage more than once, most recently with her wonderful novel, The Night Stages. We're thrilled to have her back today. Please welcome Jane Urquhart.
Thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Kingston Writers Festival and in a brand new format, which is fascinating for me because I rarely use it, but I'm learning. I was going to say Joan Thomas is the wonderful author that we are honoring here today, and she is a truly brilliant writer. I have been admiring her work for years. The first time that I met Joan, I was actually publishing a novel myself, and I met her in print rather than on stage or at a writer's festival. She in fact reviewed for the Globe and Mail my novel, The Underpainter, which with which I was fortunate enough to win the Governor General's Award. And I was just so thrilled to know that she too had been honored in this way, and about time, I would say. Joan is the author of 4 novels, most recently Five Wives, which won the 2019 Governor General's Award for Fiction. The jury wrote, "In Five Wives, Thomas delivers a compelling and powerful story about an encounter that alters the lives of those involved for generations." Set in a world where Indigenous peoples, missionaries, and the forces of global capitalism collide, Thomas's tale provides a nuanced examination of Operation Auca, a historical event that took place in Ecuador in 1956. This book raises important questions about religious fervor, autonomy, and legacies of violence. Ambitiously conceived and beautifully written, this book is a masterful achievement. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But in the meantime, I'd like to also say that Joan has won all kinds of other prizes. She won the Engel Findlay Award for Writers in Mid-Career. She won the McNally Robinson Prize for Book of the Year. And of course, she's been nominated for absolutely everything. She lives in Winnipeg, and she continues to work there, which is wonderful. So we're looking forward to her next novel. But I have to say that this one really was compelling for me, and in fact, it was haunting in such a way that that I've been unable to get certain sections out of it out of my mind at all. And as a matter of fact, it's intimidatingly good, I find, when I'm at the process of trying to write my own novel. But anyway, all that aside, I do have some questions for Joan, if I'm not.
Well, let me just jump in and say how honored I am that you are doing this, Jane. I think it's much harder to interview someone than to be interviewed, and I'm very grateful that you've taken it on.
Well, it's a great pleasure and honor for me. And I have about a million questions, but I know we don't have time for a million questions, and we want to include the audience as well. So we'll just get going. The first question that I have, I make a comment, in fact. You open with the wives piecing together what happened to their husbands. They have journal entries and letters and are waiting for photographs. And then in a nicely managed segue, you bring us into the world of the men themselves as they set up camp, horse around in the river, make a treehouse. They're there, of course, because they're hoping to make contact with the Ecuadorian Auca or Waorani. Could you tell us something about these tribes and explain the differences in naming them?
Okay. Yeah, well, that difference in name is actually quite indicative of the missionary mindset, because the word Auca was a term of derision that was used by the dominant Quechua indigenous group in Ecuador, and the missionaries heard them referring to Auca and took it as the tribal name of the Waorani people. So every time they used it, there was a term of derision in their mouths, and they didn't realize it until a lot later.
There were rumors around that the Auca buried their children alive, and engaged in all kinds of bestial acts that were much. Yes, and some of those rumors felt as if they were believed by the missionaries. Was it correct in that?
Absolutely, yeah. And the Waorani had successfully defended their territory for centuries. They'd never had a peaceful contact with the outside world, not with the conquistadors or rubber traders. And they were known for the violence of their attacks. They were very adamant. We like to think of the term uncontacted, and I think it's sort of a romantic notion that people are back in the forest waiting to find out about the Western world. But really, they were very aware of outsiders, and they had a term for them, Coyote, which meant cannibal and predator. And so they really saw the outside world as dangerous to them. They were very adamant about defending them. But I was really intrigued by all the mythology that grew up around them, because really the missionaries knew nothing. They had no language. And you began to think that they were looking for a challenge that was sort of commensurate to their gifts. These were very, very ambitious young men who were drawn to Ecuador on this quest. this huge sense of adventure, I think. Several of them were pacifists and they hadn't been involved in the war. And there was almost this militaristic thinking around it too, that they were going to conquer these people.
Yes. And it was so interesting to see how capitalism and militarism entered their collective psyche in a way. I mean, one of the things that fascinated me about these young men was, first of all, how familiar they seemed. They seemed utterly familiar to me. And I think that was partly your brilliance of setting up that opening scene where we see them doing all the kinds of stuff that boys do, young men do. They just, like they make a playhouse and then they go in the river and horse around, that sort of thing. But also I sensed the ambition and the competition among them. The fact about who is going to spot the tribe first, who's going to make the first contact. It was really, in a sense, a kind of currency for them, that ambition, that the souls became, to them, I suppose, what money is to the larger kind of capitalist enterprise. What do you think about that? Am I way off when I?
No, I think that's a really good observation. Where I saw competition was not even so much among them as with one of the women, a single woman missionary named Rachel Saint, who was making her own efforts to reach the Waorani and was doing it maybe in a way we might think of as more typical of a female way, that she got to know a Waorani woman who had left the rainforest and she was learning the language. There wasn't quite this sense of adventure of just, blundering rashly into their territory. But for sure, I saw an ambition that there was a kind of rhetoric about risking their lives, even if we have to die in this attempt, we will be martyrs. It's very foreign to us now. But with Jim Elliot, especially their leader, there's a lot of that kind of talk. If God takes me now, it'll be a victory because I will have died in seeking his will.
Exactly. It's so fascinating to think. Well, two things that I wanted to bring up as a result of that is, first of all, Rachel herself is a very interesting character, and I would say animus driven in the sense that she has what we would call a masculine personality in the sort of forward momentum of her own ambition, I think. And when I say masculine, I mean, for want of a better word, it's just sort of the animus within us, and I found her interesting because she was also the person who brought language to the enterprise. She was the one who could interpret, and therefore she could interpret the world for the other people around her. She had a great facility with language. And that, of course, is an interesting thing for a writer to work with. A character who kind of carries that through the book is quite something. And so Rachel, where did she come from exactly?
Well, there's a lot of information if you want to research Rachel Saint. There was a biography written about her called A Saint Among Savages, another very telling title. She was a formidable character, and I think a very damaged personality in some ways. There was a lot of overbearing, angry energy in the way she approached people. And I don't want to, give away too many spoilers, but historically, she is the person that really contributed to the long-term consequences of the mission for the Waorani, because she ended up living among them for the rest of her life. And she was very adamant about stripping away their traditional ways of doing things. So she's a pretty scary individual to read about. She was almost like a 19th century missionary, in her fierce defense of Western ways and the way she sort of merged Western ways with Christianity in her mind.
And she is also very judgmental about the Catholics and Catholicism in general. And in fact, of course, all the missionaries are. How could they not be? They're Protestants, So, but I still think that I remember a wonderful interchange between the Catholic priest who was there and one of the wives. You tell me which one was it? Was it
March?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mark. Yes, that's right. And you gave him one of the great lines in the book, the Catholic priest, because she says, we weren't responsible for destroying entire cultures and laying waste and despoiling the Central America and South America. And he just looks at her and says, "But you're not finished yet, are you?"
That's right. Yes. Well, Jane, he's fully an invention because he was.
Yeah.
These lives are very much within their ideological bubble, and they don't express a lot of doubt, which was quite congruent with their writings and their memoirs. And so I had to create some figures to interrogate that question, and he was one that I created. And I know that we may have many questions about how the Catholics operated in South America too, but I saw him as maybe being at the forefront of liberation theology, where he was a little bit more sensitive to the culture and so on. So he was a construct. But.
Right. And also, I think one of the most important things about this book for me was it forced me to look at the notion of othering altogether, because as a result of us getting to know your characters as well as we do when we move through the book, I personally found that I was attached to them. I cared about them, and I cared about what was going to happen to them. And yet, had I not been exposed to a book like yours, in which I was able to get to know people who were missionaries at that time in Ecuador, I probably would have been judgmental about them. You yourself never judge, which I think is a really wonderful way of entering the text. But I think people like me, in other words, those of us who who lean to the left, have a tendency to assume a kind of I guess the word would be unidimensional personality for people who are not like us. And that is quite a lesson to learn. One needs to understand, I think, the ordinariness of the people who become caught up in things like this. Otherwise, one is going to be unable to recognize it in oneself. And everyone has those frailties and weaknesses within their character.
Yes, I think you've gone right to the heart of what I was hoping to do there. And I didn't want to caricature them, and I didn't want to stand outside them. I felt that I didn't really have that luxury because I grew up in that world. And one of the reviews of this book, it was a really wonderful review, but the reviewer talked about these people as being either terribly stupid or crazy. And in point of fact, my goal was exactly the opposite, was to say how people who are intelligent can sort of buy into an ideology that will skew their thinking. And I wanted readers to experience what that's like, that kind of cognitive.
About their humanity, which I think is very important, and they're I suppose just the fact that they could have been my brother or my uncle, and those of us who grew up in the 60s and early 70s and really almost always stood back and looked at our parents as, well, in my case, I thought, gosh, they have such boring lives, having not examined the Second World War that they were involved in and what, how quickly they were required to become adults. I think that the divisiveness and craziness among generations and also among different ways of thinking with different people, and the fact that there's a kind of high moral mindedness that many of us have a tendency to slip into when not really looking too carefully at our own lives and how we too colonize places and are living on stolen land, for example, and have already committed any number of crimes against humanity and have had some crimes committed against us. I mean, humans are human, and they are, as I said before, filled with weaknesses and frailties.
Or I think of our denial of the reality of climate change and our continuing to live as if we can live this way forever. I think we all live in our bubbles to a certain extent.
Well, that's true. I mean, we all drive cars, or most of us do, and at the same time carry on about climate change.
Yeah.
I was just trying to kind of look at another question here. So when I also think that the book is about judgment and preachiness, and yet it's so brilliantly realized. Your book is so wonderfully put together that you yourself are never judgmental or preachy. So how did you manage that as a writer?
Well, as I said, I grew up in that mindset. And so I just wanted to accurately reflect it. And I guess, I use a very close, intimate third person. And it sort of allowed me to ascribe to the characters thoughts and doubts that they hardly acknowledge themselves. I wanted it to be really, really intimate. And I suppose in some respects, I did caricature a little bit. I think Rachel Saint, she was a single woman, and there was a lot of, I think these married couples somehow flaunted their closeness and happy family reality of their lives in Rachel's face. And I didn't want to pile on. I didn't want to make her the caricature of the single missionary, but I know in some ways I did send the characters up a little bit. I don't think I was entirely always empathetic towards them, although my empathy was there for her as well. What you see, what came up in my novel and surprised me is this sort of thread about childhood indoctrination. Like all of these missionaries grew up in homes where they were very heavily indoctrinated in Christianity. And there's this thread with their own children too. And I'm interested in how that shapes personalities. That sort of attitude that, you have to break a child's spirit when they're young. You have to inculcate them into the ways of faith so that they never question and they never doubt. And, it had been decades since I moved away from that world, but in some ways, writing this book really brought home freshly to me how it does shape your life. And it takes you, maybe you never get over it entirely.
Yeah, one of the little girls says, "I wish I could remember before I was saved."
Yeah.
As if there'd been a previous life in which
what the real me was like.
Yes, and there was also some. I wanted also to ask you about Wheaton College, which seemed. I thought that those passages that took place there were also something just heavily familiar to me. Obviously, I did not grow up in an evangelistic family, but the college itself, just the kind of dating and girlfriends and boyfriends and broken hearts and all of that, once again made it clear to us that, these people. But also, just to get back to the theme of othering again, they would not have been othered in the 1950s. This is what's so interesting, is the missionaries would have been celebrated big time by everyone, I would think.
That's a really good point.
You must have read all of it.
Well, if you look back to just a year ago, there was a similar missionary endeavor in the Indian Ocean where a young man named John Chow endeavored to reach a group called the North Sentinelese and was killed by these people in voluntary isolation. And it was really interesting to watch the cultural reaction, because people were appalled that he had broken the law to approach this reclusive Indigenous nation. But back in 1956, you're right, these missionaries were celebrated. There was a big article in Time magazine or Life magazine rather, and Elizabeth Elliot's memoir was a condensed Reader's Digest book. So yeah. They were closer to the mainstream for sure. We bring a different eye to the endeavor today, but for me, there was still a lot to explore, because growing up, I had never thought about the way the missionaries would act as agents for resource extraction and in an American industry. But in fact, these missionaries very deliberately helped to bring the oil companies into Huron hands. And that was a huge revelation to me, really. I was very interested in following that.
So, and that goes back to this sort of the same the same inner life propels both that kind of colonization, I guess, to use a gentle word, and capitalism. This is what I found so fascinating is exactly what you said. I mean, that was a complete revelation to me as well. Somehow you expect the two arms of colonization to be separate, one from another. In other words, this sort of one is spiritual and the other one is something that just seems flat-footed and filled with greed and want and destruction, really, and yet they're completely intertwined.
Yeah, but even when we think of that spiritual mission, I had to really, not that I supported missionary endeavors through the last few decades, but this book helped me to take apart the strands of what it means to say our ways are the only way. And, I think of all those times as a young person in church where I heard spiritual leaders in Indigenous communities described as witch doctors, and shamanistic healing described as demonic, and so on. I mean, this kind of rhetoric is still there within churches. And I've had people say to me, well, the missionaries were well-meaning, they wanted to take the gospel. And I'm not sure I would even use the term well-meaning, because there is a premise there.
Yeah, now that we know that they were involved with something for personal or for someone's personal gain, in some way or another, it makes it almost impossible to see the kind of well-meaningness of it. And of course, that's true of the Catholic Church. It's been true of the Western churches, and probably forever, in that the Catholic Church was very much a political animal. Even when, I love to think romantically about scribes and scriptoria working away and on their manuscripts, all of which is one side of it, but it isn't the whole story by any means, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I guess what strikes me too is that the Waorani traditions that were so sneered at by the missionaries, you almost wish the cultural transference had gone in the other direction, because they lived so beautifully with the rainforest. And it's quite interesting now to see that the Waorani people are real activists in fighting the Ecuadorian government for the protection of their lands. And they have a very lovely young woman as their leader right now. Her name is Namonti Nankimo, and she was just named just this week by Time Magazine as one of the 100 most influential people of 2020 for that work. So I just find it so interesting how the missionaries went in to try and save the Waorani people, but now you see the Waorani people at the forefront of the movement to save the planet from the destruction of the Amazon.
So tell us a bit about the contemporary character in the book, or at least the last one in the line of the more contemporary character, Anna. Tell us a bit about her and all of that.
Yeah, well, I did something a little strange there in that I mixed fictional and real characters, because I didn't want to intrude into the lives of the missionary families. And so I invented the subsequent generations, and I have a man, Dave, who was the son of the missionaries, and a teenage girl named Abby, who is the granddaughter. And I needed to do that to bring this kind of thinking into contemporary times, I think. I really enjoyed exploring Abby, because she's the one person that's really questioning openly. So I needed that voice.
Is separating when we first meet her, Abby is separating herself from her father's world, her father being the son of Betty Elliott. Yes, exactly. And so it's kind of interesting that she's even though, and also we meet her at her grandmother's funeral. So she's delivering the address at the funeral. But I wondered about the film, because it created another layer of experience in the novel.
Yes, well, there was a feature film made at the 50th anniversary at the 50th anniversary, there was a feature film made, and I kind of used that as a motif to get Abby re-involved in going to Ecuador, because she might be involved in the film. So,
Right. Yes. Well, that's exciting, that part too. And also, I was going to ask the question: have you been approached for film rights by any chance? Because this would
that would
be
be nice.
great.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, I will say that I had about 50 extra pages about Abby, because I'm really interested in that process of divesting yourself of the thinking of your childhood. It's a painful process for families when this happens. And I had a lot of story about Abby that ended up being too tangential to the novel and hitting the cutting room floor. So it might make its appearance somewhere else. I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. So was she, this is an invasive question and I shouldn't be asking it. However, I will. Did you feel yourself in Abby at all?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's why I wanted to keep writing, because I wanted to look at that whole process of not feeling part of the world, not feeling that you can use your own critical thinking and make up your mind about things and so on.
Right. For sure. Well, you can go on a little further about that. I just have to take care of something here. I'll be right back, I promise.
Sure. I don't know whether we can take any questions here or not.
I think, well, we probably can, but they have to come up on the screen, I think.
Okay.
I'll be right back. Perhaps you could, if you could read page 192, I think it's page 92, the part where Marge, I believe, gives the list about men.
Okay. Well, this is when Marge finds out that the men have this huge plan to go into the rainforest. She was very much against it.
Sorry about that.
Shall I read that page?
Yes, that would be.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it'd be wonderful to hear.
So they have a meeting and she hears about this treehouse and all of their plans. After everyone has been flown home to their stations and it's just Marge and Nate and the kids in the house, Marge walks down the hall to Nate's favorite hideout, the dark room. The door is closed. Nate might have a film in one of the baths, but she doesn't care. She flings the door open without knocking. His head snaps up. He's sitting reading an old Time magazine, obviously hiding. She says, "You promised me you'd only do airdrops." He doesn't look the least bit ashamed. "Are you going to stand against the Lord in this?" he says. It's the worst moment of their marriage. She walks back to the kitchen and sets about making the bread. She sprinkles yeast onto a dish of warm sugar water and then pulls out the flour canister and begins to sift the flour to get the bugs out. Is there an instance in the Bible where God spoke to a woman and contradicted what her husband said? She can't think of one, but she doesn't know the Bible as well as she should. It occurs to her that she hasn't prayed in months, possibly years, except maybe to her mother. What's to be gained by nagging God? No doubt he's as besieged moment by moment as she is. She checks the yeast. It's only produced a few feeble bubbles along the edge. Then Nate's at the doorway. "Marge, did Dunlop radio in from Quito?" "No. He was supposed to send out a torque plate for the brakes last Friday." Something like hot metal fills her chest then, a feeling she would call hatred in other circumstances. For Dunlap, whoever he is, for Nate, for men, for torque plates and lances and Enfield bolt action rifles, chainsaws, sledgehammers, stinky football pads, khaki painted tanks with guns sticking erect out of them, men in uniform swarming the decks of ships, cheering like imbeciles, all through the war when they sat in church and prayed for the troops going into France and Italy and the Philippines. She thought, this is men. This is all men, God included. Men and their gangs, men doing what they want to do. Jim, Ed, Nate. Remember the day they roofed the house, goading each other on, vying to be the biggest fool on the ridgepole? Operation Alka? It's all about men. Well, discounting Betty.
It's a wonderful little passage.
I'm just going to jump in here, ladies. It looks like we might have a question from our audience members. Yes, we do indeed. And I wondered, Jane, if you would like me to manage the questions just for the last couple of minutes.
Sure.
All right. It may be easier than trying to transmit them to you to ask. So I'll just go ahead and pose them.
Okay.
Very good. This is from Donna Wooden. She's messaging us from Coburg. Congratulations, she says, on winning the Gigi. I chose this book for a local book club. It received very polarized responses. I appreciate that you weren't judging, but not everyone did. Have you received much feedback from book clubs?
Yes, I visited some book clubs, and I have to say that I've been very pleasantly surprised in certain situations. I visited 2 book clubs that were associated with very conservative churches. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a really difficult discussion. But in fact, I found them very open-hearted and open-minded in our conversation. And so I know that if people really revered the Operation Elka missionaries, that this book is challenging for them. I know that that's the case. But I have not experienced, mostly I've experienced people being very interested in kind of questioning their memories and the construct they made of that incident.
Thank you.
One thing.
Go ahead.
One thing I was going to say was that I heard an interview with Zadie Smith recently on CBC, and that she herself was talking about her definition of what makes a really important book for her. And I'm not quoting her accurately, but the sense was that she was interested in authors who, quotes, didn't take the bait. And I think the bait is likely, I mean, I'm now extrapolating, but I presume the bait is the world of fashion to a certain extent, whether it be political fashion or fashion for that matter. In other words, they don't do the same thing as all the other authors do, and they create worlds in which they bravely enter spaces that might not be the most popular spaces to enter. And I felt that Joan's book definitely fell within that category. And I wondered what it was like for her, being that brave person that entered a world that would cause controversy for sure.
You're asking me that?
Yeah.
It just felt like a story I couldn't turn away from, because it was in my bones. I knew it as a young person. You know, I grew up in reading Elizabeth Elliot's books and sort of enshrining these missionaries. And so when we look at our own relationship in Canada with Indigenous people, and in my case, I'm part of the settler culture. We're all interrogating that. But for me, it became important not to interrogate necessarily that world as much as the world of my indoctrination in church, because it had a lot to do with Indigenous people as well. It felt important and gratifying to take a close look, actually.
Another question from Sharon Eakin. She says, I read Five Wives last year, and it is one of those books that stays with me. Do you have plans for your next novel?
I'd like to write something contemporary after having done a couple books set in the past. And I don't know how Jane is experiencing this and the rest of the writers in the audience, but it's very daunting to write about the contemporary world right now. But I'm trying to do it just because everything is changing so fast.
Yeah, I feel that we are in such a state of flux that we're not seeing anything clearly enough to be able to, with any degree of authority, set something down. That's how I feel about it right now. I'm kind of at loss for words.
Yeah. I think that's true.
Selma Kennedy asks, could you comment on the sensationalist concept of cannibalism by the Acura?
Oh, that was just something that the missionaries said. Are you talking, did they mean the Auca?
Yeah.
Oh, that was just something that the missionaries said. Actually, the Waorani were very adamantly opposed and fearful of cannibalism, so it was never a factor in the novel. It was just part of the mythology that the missionaries ascribed to at the beginning.
So in fact, it existed in their imagination.
Well, it did. I mean, the Waorani believed that the outsiders were possibly cannibals, and that was one of the reasons that they feared and dreaded them. But it was not part of their culture. No.
Thank you. Wendy Burton asks if you could talk a little about creating dialogue for real people.
Yeah, I like writing dialogue. Especially, once you've spent some time with characters and they feel alive to you. And I guess, I don't know, I do try and read it out loud sometimes so that it feels real and doesn't feel like the authorial, imposition by the author, using the characters to say something that they need to say. I think that's probably the key to it. I'll just maybe add that I have 7 narrative points of view in this book, and of the 5 back in the historic period, one of the most gratifying things to me was how differently I experienced them. Because if you look at pictures, these women look very similar, modest and so on. But in fact, they spoke differently as they came to me in the writing, and I really valued that. So I don't know if I could say anything about a key, except that I would always strive for naturalness beyond, exposition.
Yes, and that is something that's easy to fall into, to allow your character to tell the reader what's going on. There's kind of informational. I always remember that from soap operas, because of course they had to catch all the viewers up in the beginning, and so the initial 3 minutes of dialogue were always just so informational. You could hardly believe it. They were particularly family trees and various, etc.
Right.
Unless someone wants to pitch in a question very quickly, or Jane, you yourself have a last question you want to put to Joan. We've got just about a minute left, and then I'll wrap things up.
Okay, I would like to ask Joan whether she considers this to be a historic novel or a contemporary novel, because it's interesting to me that it felt very contemporary, partly because of my age. And I believe, Joan, you and I are precisely the same age. And so in my mind, often historical fiction is set back a long time ago, not something that can be remembered by me. I wondered how you felt about that.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of doing a workshop yesterday about writing historical fiction, and we talked about the current definition, which says that, the past has been rendered exotic to the reader by the passage of time, and that it should be at least 100 years or before the memory of any readers. And so by that definition, this is not historical fiction, but it's certainly fiction based on actual events. Yeah.
But probably rendered exotic to many of your readers. I'm sure will continue to be rendered at least electric. I think the Writers' Trust jury said something about the sort of lightning-like brilliance of your prose, and it's absolutely true. It's a pleasure to read your work because it's so phenomenally well written, and not only is it beautiful, but it is beautifully crafted.
Well, that's very kind of you, Jane. That means the world to me from you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the conversation, all of it. It was wonderful.
Yes, it was great to see you.
So I want to thank both Joan and Jane for what was a really stimulating and insightful conversation about a quite stellar book. Just a reminder that Five Wives and other books by Jane are available for purchase at Novel Idea here in Kingston, or certainly at your local independent bookseller. I want to thank again GG Books program, Novel Idea, and thank you to HarperCollins Canada. Also, thank you to all of you for joining us and for supporting Kingston Writers Fest. I hope to see you back here tonight for the big idea and tomorrow for our final day of event. And here's where we all wave and say goodbye.
Hi. Lovely to see you.
You too.
Bye.